Creativity is not a gift reserved for a lucky few, and Managers Not MBAs proves anyone can spark it. We will focus on what it says about business and management. Stay with me, the best part is near the end. Chapter 1 of this book is called Not MBAs. The chapters of this first part flow as follows. What I call conventional MBA programs, which are mostly for young people with little if any managerial experience. Wrong people, Chapter 1, because they are unable to use art or craft, emphasize science, in the form of analysis and technique. Wrong ways, Chapter 2. That leaves their graduates with the false impression that they have been trained as managers, which has had a corrupting effect on the education and the practice of management as well as on the organizations and societies in which it is practiced. Wrong consequences, Chapters 3, 4, 5, and 6. There has been a lot of hype about changes taking place in prominent MBA programs in recent years. Don't believe it, new MBAs? The MBA is a 1908 degree based on a 1950s strategy. The real innovations in management education, mostly in England but hardly recognized in America, serve as a bridge from the critique of Part 1 to the positive ideas for developing managers in Part 2. There is a great and unfortunate divide between management development and management education. While a full discussion of management development would require a book unto itself, the presentation of a framework of basic practices, Management Development in Practice, Chapter 8, can open up vistas for management education. The discussion of the book to this point suggests a set of general principles by which management education can be reconceived, Developing Management Education, Chapter 9. These principles have been brought to life in a family of programs that can take management education and development to a new place, by enabling managers to reflect on their own experience in the light of insightful concepts. 5 aspects of developing managers, Chapters 10 through 14. No one can create a leader in a classroom. But existing managers can significantly improve their practice in a thoughtful classroom that makes use of those experiences. All this suggests that the business schools themselves need to be reconceived, including a metamorphosis into management schools, Developing True Schools of Management, Chapter 15. But will these agents of change be able to change? Part ONE Not MBAs IT is time to recognize conventional MBA programs for what they are or else to close them down. They are specialized training in the functions of business, not general educating in the practice of managing. Using the classroom to help develop people already practicing management is a fine idea, but pretending to create managers out of people who have never managed is a sham. It is time that our business schools gave proper attention to management. This may seem like a strange contention at a time when MBA programs are at the height of their popularity, when MBA graduates are at the pinnacle of their success, and when American business, which has relied so heavily on this credential, seems to have attained its greatest stage of development. I shall argue that much of this success is delusory, that our approach to educating leaders is undermining our leadership, with dire economic and social consequences. Every decade in the United States alone, almost 1 million people with a credential called the MBA descend on the economy, most with little first-hand knowledge of customers and workers, products and processes. There they expect to manage people who have that knowledge, which they gained in the only way possible through intensive personal experience. But lacking that credential, such people are increasingly relegated to a slow track where they are subjected to the leadership of people who lack the legitimacy to lead. Considered as education for management, conventional MBA programs train the wrong people in the wrong ways with the wrong consequences. This is the argument I shall pursue in part 1 of this book. It contains 7 chapters. The first is about the wrong people, the second about the wrong ways, the next 4 about the wrong consequences. Considers recent changes in MBA programs, concluding that most of these are cosmetic. A dominant design established itself in the 1960s and continues to hold most of this education firmly in its grip. The notable exceptions are found mostly in England, whose innovations provide a bridge to part 2 of this book. Some clarifications to begin. First, by conventional MBA, I mean full-time programs that take relatively young people, generally in their 20s, and train them mostly in the business functions, out of context in other words, independent of any specific experience in management. This describes most MBA programs today, in the United States and around the world. With a few exceptions, the remaining ones, usually called EMBAs, take more experienced people on a part-time basis and then do much the same thing. In other words, they train the right people in the wrong ways with the wrong consequences. That is because they mostly fail to use the experience these people have. Second, I use the words management and leadership interchangeably. It has become fashionable, after Zalesnik 1977, to distinguish them. Leadership is supposed to be something bigger, more important. I reject this distinction, simply because managers have to lead and leaders have to manage. Management without leadership is sterile. Leadership without management is disconnected and encourages hubris. We should not be ceding management to leadership, in MBA programs or anywhere else. Third, I refer to the schools in question in 3 ways, usually as business schools, in reference to what most of them are, sometimes as management schools, in reference to what they could be, and, especially in the last chapter, as M/B schools, in reference to what I conclude is the appropriate role for most of them balanced attention to both management and business. The MBA was first introduced in 1908. It last underwent serious revision based on 2 reports published in the late 1950s. Business schools pride themselves in teaching about new product development and strategic change, yet their flagship, the MBA, is a 1908 degree with a 1950s strategy. Of this book develops this conclusion. Part 2 proposes some real change. Chapter 2, 1 Wrong People. It's never too late to learn, but sometimes too early. Charlie Brown in Peanuts. There are no natural surgeons, no natural accountants. These are specialized jobs that require formal training, initially in a classroom. The students must, of course, be able to handle a scalpel or a keyboard, but first they have to be specially educated. Then they can be foisted on a suspecting public, at least for internship or articling, before being allowed to practice on their own. Leadership is different. There are natural leaders. Indeed, no society can afford anything but natural leaders. Leadership and management are life itself, not some body of technique abstracted from the doing and the being. Education cannot pour life experience into a vessel of native intelligence, not even into a vessel of leadership potential. But it can help shape a vessel already brimming with the experiences of leadership and life. Put differently, trying to teach management to someone who has never managed is like trying to teach psychology to someone who has never met another human being. Organizations are complex phenomena. Managing them is a difficult, nuanced business, requiring all sorts of tacit understanding that can only be gained in context. Trying to teach it to people who have never practiced is worse than a waste of time. It demeans management. Chapter 3, Management as a Practice. Were management a science or a profession, we could teach it to people without experience. It is neither. Management is not a science, is about the development of systematic knowledge through research. That is hardly the purpose of management. Management is not even an applied science, for that is still a science. Management certainly applies science. Managers have to use all the knowledge they can get, from the sciences and elsewhere. But management is more art, based on insight, vision, intuition. Peter Drucker wrote in 1954 that the days of the intuitive manager are numbered, 93. Half a century later we are still counting. And most management is craft, meaning that it relies on experience learning on the job. This means it is as much about doing in order to think as thinking in order to do. Put together a good deal of craft with a certain amount of art and some science, and you end up with a job that is above all a practice. There is no one best way to manage, it all depends on the situation. Effective managing therefore happens where art, craft, and science meet. But in a classroom of students without managerial experience, these have no place to meet. There is nothing to do. Linda Hill, 1992, writes in her book about people becoming managers that they had to act as managers before they understood what the role was, 67. In other words, where there is no experience, there is no room for craft. Inexperienced students simply cannot understand the practice. As for art, nothing stops that from being discussed, even admired, in the conventional MBA classroom. But the inexperience of the students stops it from being appreciated. They can only look on as non-artists do, observing it without understanding how it came to be. That leaves science, which is what conventional MBA education is mostly about, at least in the form of analysis. So, as will be discussed in Chapter 2, conventional MBA students graduate with the impression that management is analysis, specifically the making of systematic decisions and the formulation of deliberate strategies. This, I argue in Chapter 3, is a narrow and ultimately distorted view of management that has encouraged two dysfunctional styles in practice: calculating, overly analytical, and heroic, pretend art. These are later contrasted with a more experience-based style labeled engaging, quiet and connected, involving, and inspiring. Management is not a profession. It has been pointed out that engineering, too, is not a science or an applied science so much as a practice in its own right, Lewin 1979. But engineering does apply a good deal of science, codified and certified as to its effectiveness. And so it can be called a profession, which means it can be taught in advance of practice, out of context. In a sense, a bridge is a bridge, or at least steel is steel, even if its use has to be adapted to the circumstances at hand. The same can be said about medicine. Many illnesses are codified as standard syndromes to be treated by specific techniques. But that cannot be said of management, Whitley 1995:92. Little of its practice has been reliably codified, let alone certified as to its effectiveness. So management cannot be called a profession or taught as such. Because engineering and medicine have so much codified knowledge that must be learned formally, the trained expert can almost always outperform the layperson. Not so in management. Few of us would trust the intuitive engineer or physician, with no formal training. Yet we trust all kinds of managers who have never spent a day in a management classroom, and we have suspicions about some others who spent 2 years there, as will be discussed in Chapter 3. Ever since the 1910s, when Frederick Taylor, 1911, wrote about that one best way, in Henri Fayol, 1916/1984, claimed that managerial ability can and should be acquired in the same way as technical ability at school. Later in the workshop, 14, we have been on this search for the holy grail of management as a science and a profession. In Britain, a group called the Management Charter Initiative sought to barrel ahead with the certification of managers, not making the case for management as a profession so much as assuming it. As its director told a newspaper, the MBA is the only truly global qualification, the only license to trade internationally. Watts 1997:43. The statement is nonsense, and the group has failed in those efforts. It is time to face a fact. After almost a century of trying, by any reasonable assessment, management has become neither a science nor a profession. It remains deeply embedded in the practices of everyday living. We should be celebrating that fact, not depreciating it. And we should be developing managers who are deeply embedded in the life of leading, not professionals removed from it. Those fields of work discussed earlier can be divided into ones in which the person doing it truly knows better than the recipients, and others in which acting as the expert who knows better can get in the way. Upon being wheeled into an operating room, few of us would be inclined to second-guess the surgeon. "Could you cut a little lower, please?" No matter how miserable the bedside manner, we accept that he or she knows better. But a schoolteacher who acts on the basis of knowing better can impede the learning of the student. School teaching is a facilitating activity, more about encouraging learning than doing teaching. Managing is largely a facilitating activity, too. Sure, managers have to know a lot, and they often have to make decisions based on that knowledge. But, especially in large organizations and those concerned with knowledge work, managers have to lead better, so that others can know better and therefore act better. They have to bring out the best in other people. The idea that the chief does it all, coming up with the grand strategy and then driving its implementation by everyone else, is frequently a myth left over from the mass production of simple goods. Yet it is one of the impressions left by MBA education. Our goal is to create an environment where students learn how to tackle difficult, complex problems. Students learn what it feels like to exercise judgment, make decisions, and take responsibility. In Message from the Dean, Harvard Business School website, 2003. Because grade school teachers can easily carry their skills from one classroom to another, they can still be called professionals. But not so managers, who can hardly carry their skills from one function to another within the same organization, let alone across organizations or industries. In other words, knowledge about context is not as portable in management as it is in education or engineering or medicine. That is why so many managers who have succeeded in one place fail in others, which is hardly true of teachers or engineers or physicians so long as they stick to the skills they have. Imagine a guest manager. The very idea seems absurd. How could anyone just come in and manage something? The manager must have a deep understanding of the context. Yet we accept substitute teachers who take over classrooms for a day, and doctors without borders who set up hospitals in hours. But temporary managers? The one obvious example is instructive: a guest conductor. A few rehearsals, and off go the musicians performing at the most prestigious concert halls in the world. The reason is simple: the whole exercise is so highly programmed. Mozart is pulling the strings, everyone plays to his highly orchestrated score. We shall have professional management as soon as other organizations become as programmed as the symphony orchestra, playing their strategies like scores from Mozart, with all the obedient employees and customers sitting in neat rows responding on cue. The practice of management is characterized by its ambiguity. That is why, despite its popular use, the metaphor of the conductor on the podium is wholly inappropriate, at least during performance, if not necessarily rehearsal. See Mintzberg 1998. Most work that can be programmed in an organization need not concern its managers directly. Specialists can be delegated to do it. That leaves the managers mostly with the messy stuff, the intractable problems, the complicated connections. And that is what makes the practice of management so fundamentally soft, and why labels such as experience, intuition, judgment, and wisdom are so commonly used for it. Here is how a successful manager at a major airline described her MBA husband to me. He has the technique, thinks he knows best. But he is frustrated because he doesn't understand the complexities and the politics. He thinks he has the answers but is frustrated by being unable to do anything about it. He never learned management in the business school. Chapter 4: Experience in MBA Admissions. Most business schools today require work experience of their MBA applicants, typically up to about 4 years. Some, in fact, are openly biased against much more than that, and Harvard apparently made the decision recently to reduce that to about 2 years and accept some applicants straight out of undergraduate studies. But what is the use of a few years of experience, especially when it is not managerial? Can that install the necessary depth of understanding about how organizations work and what management means? Imagine dropping a young MBA student into a classroom of experienced managers, even in a course on a specialized business function such as marketing or finance. So long as the class remains with theory and technique, in other words, remains at a generic level, the student would be fine. But as soon as the discussion turns to application, to nuance and appreciation, the student would be lost. In this respect, a classroom full of such students is always lost. If you know how to design a great motorcycle engine, quipped Richard Rumelt, a professor of strategy at UCLA, I can teach you all you need to know about strategy in a few days. If you have a PhD in strategy, years of labor are unlikely to give you ability to design great new motorcycle engines. Business is about motorcycle engines, strategy is the means, motorcycle engines are the end. Conventional MBA programs are about strategy in the absence of motorcycle engines. Of course, this lack of experience suggests that the problem is not the wrong people so much as the wrong time. Do MBA programs teach the right people at the wrong time? I think not, for 2 reasons. First, too early can make the right people wrong. Giving them a questionable impression of managing can distort how they practice it subsequently. Chapters 4 and 5 present some evidence on this. My colleague Jonathan Gosling has made an intriguing suggestion in this regard. The MBA appeals to people who are just gaining their independence from family and roots. Going global, for example, sounds good to them. Yet management is about something quite the opposite, namely, the acceptance of responsibility. So MBA programs may be inadvertently encouraging an attitude of independence that is fundamentally antithetical to the responsible practice of management. Second, I argue that MBA programs by their very nature attract many of the wrong people: too impatient, too analytical, too much need to control. These characteristics, together with the MBA credential, may get them into managerial positions. But with what consequences? That is the subject of chapters 3 through 6. Chapter 5: The Applications Charade. At the time of this initial writing, with a great deal of publicity and considerable help from McKinsey & Company, a new business school was being set up in India. The Indian magazine Business World, Gupta 2000, reported on its application criteria. Students must be smart team players with proven leadership qualities and 2 years of work experience. How to select for such proven leadership qualities after only 2 years? Selection criteria: GMAT scores, college performance, extracurricular and work experience. This is typical of how people get into MBA programs. In the first instance, they select themselves, presumably in the belief that leading is better than following, and pays better. In fact, many people apply to MBA programs not just to move up but to move out to find a better job somewhere else. In other words, to get away from the source of whatever limited experience they do have. Should that be telling us something? The business schools choose from this pool. They select from among these self-selected leaders. The schools may look for evidence of leadership potential, posts held in extracurricular clubs, etc., but when they boast about the quality of their students, they almost inevitably cite GMAT scores and grade point averages. Nicely numerical, all these the business schools' own bottom lines. But do they measure managerial potential? GMAT stands for Graduate Management Admission Test, and it assesses one's ability to give fast answers to little numerical and verbal problems. If Mario was 32 years old 8 years ago, how old was he X years ago? X 40, B, X 24, C, 40X, D, 24X, E, 24 plus X, GMAT 2000. This is accompanied by an analytical writing task. Since how well you do depends on how well everyone else does, you had better prepare by buying a special book or taking a special course, because that is what everyone else is doing. Take the Kaplan Exam Preparation Program and get the score you need to get into the school you want, claims one big provider on its website, 2003. So instead of practicing management, the would-be manager practices tests. Good managers are certainly intelligent, and the GMAT certainly measures intelligence, at least formalized intelligence. But non-managers can be intelligent, too, as are no small number of dreadful managers. So the GMAT constitutes a useful but insufficient screening device, more useful, in fact, to identify successful students than successful managers. The latter have to exhibit all kinds of other characteristics that are not measured by such scores, indeed, many that are not adequately measured by any scores. An MBA student at my own university once reproached me for having mentioned intuition in regard to the selection of MBA students. How can you possibly select for intuition, he insisted, when you can't even measure it? How indeed? Another asked whether the use of judgment in the selection process would not introduce bias. Sure, I replied, because bias is the other side of judgment. The best way to get rid of bias is to get rid of judgment. MBA programs that rely on these numerical scores get rid of judgment, and so, too, do they get rid of assessing managerial potential. In the process, they introduce their own bias for science over art and craft. Sure, the schools need some way to select the right people. But not from a pool of the wrong people. And not by the use of superfluous criteria. There is another way to select, which will be discussed in Chapter 9, from a pool of practicing managers, based on their demonstrated success as managers. Chapter 6, The Will to Manage versus the Zest for Business. In a classic Harvard Business Review article published over 3 decades ago, The Myth of the Well-Educated Manager, Sterling Livingston, 1971:84, wrote that many people who aspire to high-level managerial positions lack the will to manage. Not the need to manage but the will to manage. They are not motivated to manage. They are motivated to earn high salaries and to attain high status. Successful managing, in Livingston's opinion, is not about one's own success but about fostering success in others. Universities and business organizations that select managerial candidates on the basis of their records as individual performers often pick the wrong people to develop as managers. Fewer management graduates are willing to make the sacrifices required to learn management from the bottom up. Increasingly, they hope to step in at the top from positions where they observe, analyze, and advise. Interesting words from 1971. Some of these applicants do have another important characteristic, which Alfred North Whitehead, in another important article about business schools, published in 1932, labeled the zest for business, which is not the same as the zest for riches. Business schools have been effective at encouraging people with that zest and sometimes at encouraging others to get it. That may be their most important contribution to the economy. But they have also allowed this zest for business to be confused with that will to manage. In a sense, the former is about getting the most out of resources, the latter is about taping the energy of people. That people have become human resources in business schools and so much business practice is further evidence of this problem. 1. There are people who have both the will to manage and the zest for business, just as there are people who have neither. The former would seem most suitable for leadership positions in large corporations, just as the latter are suitable for no leadership positions. Those who have the will but not the zest may be suitable for public and social sector organizations. The problem is in the remaining box, with those who have the zest for business but not the will to manage. Such people are numerous in MBA programs. They may make good investment bankers, financial analysts, or consultants, which is what many of them in fact became. A famous one is discussed in the accompanying box, but often in the hope of running big corporations. I cite evidence in Chapter 4 suggesting that a surprising number of those who succeed in that hope fail in those positions. They should have remained where they were or else run their own small businesses, although other evidence cited there suggests that the record of MBAs as entrepreneurs is not strong. 1. Business or management. Not much will to manage, but plenty of zest for business. I didn't know what to do after the Navy. I didn't have any better idea than doing an MBA, said one holder of this degree, from Stanford, quoted in Craner and Dearlove 1999:78. Not much will to manage, apparently. But he certainly did have a zest for business. He didn't end up as a manager. But he did do well in his chosen field, gaining great fame and making much money. His name is Tom Peters. His MBA degree is not a magic wand that transforms inexperienced and immature undergraduates into licensed managers. So said Arnaud de Meyer et al., 1992:28, as head of the INSEAD MBA program. His counterparts, however, have generally thought otherwise. This program is designed to develop high-potential managers, claims the University of Virginia Darden School on its website, 2003. The Baruch School in New York describes business schools as incubators for the business leaders of tomorrow. And a faculty member of that new school in India said, "We will be interviewing people with the notion that we are training them to be managers." Gupta 2000:53-54. The business schools take this rhetoric seriously. They welcome people with the zest for business or for power, or for riches, assume they have the will to manage, fill them up with courses on finance, marketing, and so forth, sprinkled with a few about management, not on managing, and then tell them that they are ready to manage. If the schools take this seriously, then why shouldn't he the graduates? Most damaging of all, many of the hiring corporations, or at least people in their human resource departments, eager for a convenient source of managerial talent, take it seriously, too. It is, to repeat, a sham. To conclude, we need leaders with human skills, not professionals with academic credentials. In the larger organizations especially, success depends not on what the managers themselves do, as allocators of resources and makers of decisions, so much as on what they help others to do. So what should I tell Robert, a young man who came to see me about doing an MBA? It is with this question, discussed in the accompanying box, that I conclude this first chapter. Robert came to see me, the son of an old friend. He wanted to do an MBA. Where should he go? That question comes up all the time. Bright young people, bored with a year or two of full-time work and looking for a better position somewhere else, see the MBA as a launching device. And I always give the same answer: earn your leadership. Find an industry you like, get to know it, prove your potential, and practice management. Then get educated in management. Conventional MBA programs, I tell them, are a waste of time for managerial work. In fact, they can distort true managerial potential. The eyes always glaze over at this point. No one actually says, I came to find out which school to go to and you tell me this, but that is what seems to be on their minds. Instead, they say, in good years, but look what awaits me if I get an MBA from a good school, a big salary, an important job, recruiters falling all over me, maybe even a signing bonus like a football star, the fast track, the good life. How could I tell Robert not to do the MBA? Don't worry. I haven't done any harm in all this, because I doubt that a single one ever took my advice. They were all intent, as was I at that stage, to do the degree. Until Joe came along. Same question. Same answer. But Joe's eyes didn't glaze over. At least he left wondering. I've stayed in touch with Joe for several years now. A few months later he was accepted at a good business school. He decided not to go. Instead, he changed jobs. He loves his new work, he told me, and is learning a lot. He has doubts about the MBA now and is considering other options for further education. Maybe there is hope. Search settings Q support sign out 20. Chapter 7, 2 Wrong Ways. The second-handness of the learned world is the secret to its mediocrity. Alfred North Whitehead. There are no right ways to develop the wrong people. We could, therefore, stop here and have a really short chapter. But the problem goes much deeper, and so does this chapter and those that follow. The MBA programs not only fail to develop managers but give their students a false impression of managing that, when put into practice, is undermining our organizations and our societies. Indeed, the ways of the MBA, the contents of the programs and the methods by which they are taught are so entrenched that they are regularly used, with similar consequences, for the right people, namely, practicing managers in so-called executive MBA and shorter management development programs. In this chapter, I will discuss how MBAs are educated, first the content of these programs and then the methods used. I will consider the dysfunctional consequences of this education on management practice in the next chapters. But first, a brief review of the history of business education, which will help explain why business schools today use the content and methods they do. Chapter 8, A Brief History of Business Education. Business education began on a rather positive note but later deteriorated up to the 1950s, when some remarkable changes began to take place. We live with these changes today. Chapter 9: The Formative Years. Business education is usually traced back to the University of Pennsylvania, which set up a bachelor's program in business in 1881, thanks to the efforts of businessman Joseph Wharton. In a paper on the origins of business education, see also Redlich 1957, J. Spender, 1997, argues otherwise, tracing this effort back to the Prussian school of bureaucratic statecraft, which developed an agenda that sounds very much like business schools today: the application of the scientific method, meaning rigorous measurement, data collection, record-keeping, statistical analysis, and the development of rational legal modes of order, decision-making, and control over social activities. 13. Something akin to cases was also used, as well as field studies, and a debate arose over whether such training should be for administrative technicians, staffers, or business leaders, which continues to this day and in this book. Joseph Wharton was an American businessman who learned German and visited Prussia. He is thought to have carried these ideas straight into his proposal for the business school that bears his name. He criticized the learning by doing, Sass 1982:22, common in the American commercial colleges of the day, and he insisted that the University of Pennsylvania curriculum include accounting, mercantile law, and economics. Soon after, finance and statistics were added. When Edmund James, who did his doctorate in Germany, became dean in 1887, the Wharton School was well underway, Spender 1997:20, in Prussian tradition. Faces shifted over the years that followed, but Sass, 1982:294, records that when he accepted the deanship in 1972, Donald Carroll embraced the school's original Jamesian vision, Spender 1997:21. Enter the MBA. Dartmouth College was the first school to offer a master's degree in business, in 1900, when it allowed a few undergraduates to extend their coursework by an additional year, Schlossman et al. Harvard University followed in 1908 with the first program called a Master of Business Administration, which the President's office apparently referred to as an ugly label, Heaton 1968-71. Stanford introduced the second in 1925, although undergraduate education in business had by then been firmly established in the United States. The American Association of, now Association to Advance, Collegiate Schools of Business, AACSB, later to become the accrediting agency, was established in 1916. But neither Harvard nor Stanford had an easy time, having to contend with unenthusiastic sponsors from the business community, boisterous and skeptical students, and jealous and cynical university colleagues and trustees, not to mention financial troubles, Schlossman et al. 33 students enrolled in the Harvard MBA program in 1908, only 8 returned for the second year. 4 MBA degrees were granted in 1919, 15, 17. Interestingly, the principal impetus for this university-based business education came from academics, economists, psychologists, sociologists, and political scientists, most of whom lacked first-hand knowledge about business and, indeed, had few ties to businessmen. Nevertheless, they were confident that they could discover an underlying science of business, convey that science to the future leaders of corporate America, and thereby develop a new profession of management. Even at Harvard, all 4 founders were academics with limited business experience, 11, including Edwin Gay, the first dean, who had also done his doctoral thesis in Germany. The advent of cases early on, there were 2 competing themes, one based on general knowledge about business conduct, the other, specialized knowledge about operations of specific industries. Harvard, for example, had required courses in principles of accounting, commercial law, and economic resources of the United States, as well as electives in fields such as banking and railroad operations. Schlossman et al. Mostly the lecture method was favored at Harvard, except in commercial law, where examples were taken from public court decisions. Gradually, this use of examples became more widespread and was seen as giving rise to the case study method. But the real impetus for the widespread use of cases seems to have come from a Chicago businessman named Art Shaw. He first used them in the undergraduate business program at Northwestern University and subsequently approached Gleason et al. Cases first entered the Harvard MBA in a second-year required course called Business Policy, which became part of the curriculum in 1912. Individual businessmen were invited to present and discuss a problem from their own desk. 2 days later, each student handed in a written report embodying his analysis of the problem and his recommended solution, which the businessman subsequently discussed with the class. Copeland 1954:33. The students apparently liked this, but the use of cases was not to spread until after World War I, under a new dean named Wallace Donham, a banker. Donham later remarked about his arrival, "I had no theoretical knowledge of business, and my faculty, I found, had little practical knowledge of business." It was a difficult problem to fit the two together, in Gleason et al. Shaw's idea solved Donham's problem and another as well, pressures from the students, who stomped their feet when lectures became boring. Donham named Copeland, a notoriously poor lecturer and a victim of foot-stomping protests, to run Harvard's Bureau of Business Research and told him to convert it from statistical data to case collection. Copeland converted his marketing course, too, and miraculously, the foot-stomping stopped. 18. Donham did not force others to use the method, but Harvard's enormously successful effort to mass-produce cases created considerable pressure on the faculty to include them, and by the mid-1920s cases had infiltrated most courses. Gleason et al. 1993:18, where they remain today. At Northwestern, meanwhile, where the administration never took a formal position on the case method, the use of cases remained, and remains, highly individualized. Gleason et al. 1993:25. Cases for the sake of theory. Donham assumed that cases would be used to introduce theoretical issues in a palatable, down-to-earth manner. He also believed that the writing of cases would encourage the generation of theory. In fact, he described the case study as simply a method of interesting the student, with no magic, just a way to carry the student much farther into theory. Gleason et al. His faculty, however, had other ideas and took the school's use of cases somewhere else, where it remained for most of the rest of the century and, to a considerable extent, today. According to Gleason et al., 3 groups comprised the faculty. First, the industry specialists, often prominent businessmen, taught the popular courses on specific industries, many of which Donham managed to eliminate. Second, the functional specialists, in areas such as marketing, finance, and production, were encouraged by Donham in his early years to combat this industry specialization. He insisted, largely in vain, that they discuss their functional problems within the context of the entire firm. Finally, the homegrown faculty came in as case writers, often having used them to get the new doctoral degree. They saw cases differently, as being most valuable when they encouraged students to abandon the search for theory and to learn how to make realistic and difficult decisions on their own. 32. Donham tried to counter this third group by reducing the expenditures on case writing by almost 2/3, and by promoting social science research, involving in the school such illustrious scholars as Elton Mayo, Joseph Schumpeter, and Talcott Parsons. But his was a losing cause. Generalizable business theories did not spring forth from the case studies. 33. So early on the stage was set for the great debate of business education, the theory of the original Wharton, rooted in scholarship, versus the practice of Harvard, rooted in experience, ostensibly that learning by doing so roundly criticized by Joseph Wharton. Yet a look at the courses offered by Harvard, from the outset, gives cause to wonder whether these differences in approach were all that significant. On to market success and academic failure from these origins, the business schools rose to prominence in the United States. From about 40 in 1915, the next 10 years saw the addition of 143 more, Chait 1975:91, 110 master's degrees were granted in 1920, 1,017 in 1932, and 3,357 in 1948, Gordon and Howell 1959:21. But the academic quality did not follow. Harvard persisted with its case studies, and by 1949 had graduated almost half of all MBAs, Aronson 1992:168, but most schools descended into a kind of dark age of business education. By the end of the 1930s, much of Stanford's graduate program was perilously close to undergraduate studies, Gleason et al. 1993:35, while Columbia experienced the triumph of vocationalism, the teaching of job-specific skills, Aronson 1992:163, 164. At Wharton, professors more interested in consulting than researching conspired with the practical concerns of job-conscious students to frustrate Joseph Wharton's broad intentions. Mass 2001:297. Management itself was taught in business schools as a collection of vague principles, akin to folk wisdom, for example, that the manager's span of control should not exceed 7. See Simon S. 1957, Critique of these Principles. By the late 1940s, the inability of even such elite institutions as Harvard, Stanford, Columbia, and Chicago to respond to the clarion call for a new type of manager was obvious. Business was changing rapidly, but the knowledge available to students through both textbooks and cases was not. Schlossman et al. Chapter 10. The Return to Academic Respectability. The Carnegie Monastery, the Irish monastery of the business school dark age, was a remarkable place in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, called the Graduate School of Industrial Administration, GSIA, at the Carnegie Institute of Technology, now Carnegie Mellon University. GSIA did not, however, keep the light of academia shining so much as turn it back on in the 1950s. The precipitating event was the 1946 hiring of an economist named George Leland Bach, after wartime service in the Federal Reserve, to restart Carnegie's economics department. Bach brought in William Cooper from the field of operations research, mathematical applications to systems problems, which had become prominent in wartime applications, and they hired Herbert A. Simon, a brilliant young political scientist, to direct the undergraduate program in business. Zalesnik, 1968, later wrote in Fortune magazine that Simon's hiring was a signal to the academic community that a business school might be an appropriate place in which to work on profound, if less immediately relevant problems. 206. Pressures were building during the Cold War to improve U.S. management capabilities, and when a grant of almost $6 million came from William Lorimer Mellon to endow a new school of industrial administration at Carnegie, Bach became its first dean, bringing along his economics department. The vision was clear from the outset, and not unrelated to the original German and Wharton efforts, let alone some of Donham's unrealized beliefs. Systematic research matters, teaching follows. Research was their fundamental engine of progress. Gleason and Schlossman 1995:14. 26 Research should be descriptive above all, especially to understand business and organizations. Prescription could follow, in practice. Such research should be rooted in a set of underlying disciplines, notably economics, psychology, and mathematics. These should also be central to master's level courses as well as being the foundations of such business functions as finance, marketing, and accounting. The classroom is a place to ground the students in the skills of analytical problem solving, in the style of operations research, or management science. Particular attention should be given to doctoral studies, to stimulate research and have the graduates carry these ideas to other schools. One thing, however, did not much figure in all of this: the development of managers. GSIA was more concerned about getting the academic house in order and its professors properly respected. So it had to look inward, to its status in the university, not outward, to the needs of practicing managers. But this was a problem not so much ignored as assumed away, as it has been ever since, that properly respectable academic schools would produce properly practicing managers. Besides, if to manage is to make good decisions, then developing students' analytic skills could only improve the practice of management. The GSIA faculty researched a remarkably broad and interesting set of issues, but never those just discussed. They never tested their own assumptions. Indeed, over time they retreated into the disciplines, and management, called administration, which had been the focus of early attempts at integration, simply disappeared. GSIA in those years staffed itself with very smart people educated largely in the social science disciplines. Bach was an economist, Simon, a political scientist, Cooper, a statistician. All became famous, as did many of their subsequent hires: Richard Syart, economics; James March, political science; Harold Levitt, psychology; Alan Newell, mathematics; Franco Modigliani and Morton Miller, economics/finance. The last two together, and Simon, separately, eventually won the economics prize named for Alfred Nobel. Bach described GSIA, in Gleason and Schlossman 1995:13-23, as a hardball place, with no room for second-rate work, where everyone debated everything. Well, almost everything. Most important, GSIA faculty worked together, integrating around the disciplines as well as the newly emerging information technology of the computer. Some of their most important work focused on organizations. Although important work on them had been done earlier, notably by Max Weber, the great German sociologist, see Gerthen Mills 1958, GSIA, led especially by Simon, put organization theory on the map. See especially Simon 1947, 1957, March and Simon 1958, and Syart and March 1963. See also the Starbuck Review, 2002. With the faltering of the other business schools, GSIA became the great hope. Here was academic respectability for the offering, fully up-to-date, with computers and mathematics. This could not only link the schools with established academic disciplines but also make them centers for the integration of some work in those disciplines. GSIA most certainly did this, at least in its early years. Its research output and conceptual insights, across psychology and economics, especially about organizations, were extraordinary. GSIA during the 1950s was undoubtedly the most exciting center of scholarship that has ever been seen in a business school. And it leveraged that effort to produce a steady stream of doctoral students who eventually had enormous influence on other business schools, many as deans. The turning point of 1959 when two major studies were commissioned in the late 1950s to consider the dire straits of the American business schools, one by the Ford Foundation, Gordon and Howell 1959, the other by the Carnegie Corporation, Pearson 1959, it should come as no surprise that GSIA served as their model. In fact, Bach was closely associated with both reports, Gleason and Schlossman 1995-26, and contributed a chapter to the Pearson report that argued for analytical, rational decision-making as the key to management education, Bach 1959. Gordon and Howell, 1959, describe business education as gnawed by doubts and harassed by the barbs of unfriendly critics, finding itself at the foot of the academic table. They search for academic respectability, while most of them continue to engage in unrespectable vocational training. 4. The proposed solution was a sophisticated command of analytical and research tools derived from the fundamental disciplines, as well as sound training in the physical and social sciences and mathematics and statistics, combined with the ability to apply these tools to business problems. 100, italics added, supplemented by cases and the like to give the student some limited experience in dealing with the kinds of problems he will encounter in the business world. 135-36, italics added. The report also called for releasing more faculty time for scholarly activity and formal research. 391. And it urged business schools to develop closer cooperation with the underlying disciplines, by seeking to interest more behavioral scientists, mathematicians, and statisticians in business problems and offering more training in these related areas for doctoral candidates. And present faculty members, 392. The Pearson report conveyed much the same message, with perhaps more concern for integration among the various subjects, talking of increased academic standards, serious academic work, 9, and the prime role for research, 15. The assumption once again, as articulated later by Whitley, 1995, was that research would produce general scientific knowledge, which could be directly applied to managerial tasks. Effective managers could thus be made through formal university training programs. 81. But the report referred to business and businessmen more than managing and managers, which has proved to be an important distinction. If ever words on paper have rendered significant changes, these two reports are certainly examples. Their spirit and much of their specific content, save their calls for what we now call soft skills and for integration across the functions, were widely adopted by business schools across the United States and then around the world. The Ford Foundation also injected $35 million between 1954 and 1966 to create centers of excellence at Carnegie, Stanford, and a few other schools, Mass 2001:9. The pendulum thus swung with a vengeance, from the practical to the academic indeed, to the very place where Joseph Wharton had tried to secure it almost a century earlier. Like the phoenix, the business schools thus arose from their own ashes. Stanford, for example, having been in stalemate between 1945 and 1958, the epitome of what the reformers sought to replace, was transformed and captured a leading role in the vanguard of what Gleason, 1997:8-22, has called the New Look, as did Wharton itself. With these changes came new academic respect on campus, Chait 1985:46. Research came to the forefront, and doctoral programs flourished as business schools took their place alongside the accepted professional schools and scientific disciplines. The U. Government even issued a commemorative postage stamp in 1981, Chait 1985:4647, to honor the 100th anniversary of Joseph Wharton's initiative. It read Professional Management. That stamp should have read Business Research, except who would have bought it, for it was in research that these two reports brought about their revolution. While management hardly became a profession or, indeed, received much attention in the business schools at all, research, especially in the functions of business, flourished. Scholars from all sorts of backgrounds gathered in business schools to address issues of marketing, finance, analysis, human behavior in organizations, and so on. James March, who went to the Stanford Business School some years after he left Carnegie, has made a case for the importance of such research, but with an interesting twist. Hardly one to avoid provoking, March claimed not only that the business school's primary role is to produce research, contribute to knowledge, but that this beneficially happens through the subterfuge of large expenditures on research. Concealed within the rhetoric and accounting of education, in Schmotter 1995:59. MBA students could hardly be expected to embrace March's point. Indeed, some early GSIA students themselves described their colleagues as having become skeptical about the professional relevance of the faculty's research agenda, at a 1958 conference. Devoted to learning about recent faculty investigations, it became apparent that the alumni no longer cared much and perhaps never had cared about the school's research output, quoted in Schmotter 1995:140. But no matter, with the MBA's newfound respectability, enrollment took off. From 4,041 business master's degrees granted in the United States in 1958, most of these MBAs, and 6,375 in 1964, the numbers more than doubled in the next 2 years, to 12,998. 10 years later, in 1976, they reached 42,654. The year after that, Forbes magazine called the MBA second in esteem only to the coveted Doctor of Medicine as a passport to the good life, quoted in Chait 1985:46. The numbers continued to grow rapidly, although not at that pace. By 1997-1998, they passed the 100,000 mark, AACSB website, November 2001. At this rate, the United States alone now produces upwards of 1 million people per decade who believe that they have the capacity to manage by virtue of having spent 2 years in an academic school of business. It is to this unexamined yet flourishing proportion that we now turn. Chapter 11. Questioning the content. When a pendulum swings too far in one direction, its inertia generally sends it swinging back the other way. Not so the business school pendulum, which has been stuck in one direction for almost half a century. Pearson wrote in his 1959 report, "If business schools in increasing numbers move in the direction prescribed, the charge will doubtless be made that their work would soon become too academic, and thus lose much of its value in terms of specific career training." Again, viewed against the record to date, the likelihood that this will occur is remote indeed. Too bad Pearson could not have assessed this concern against the record to come, for it has proved to be not remote but prophetic. How strong is the gravitational pull of respectability, Murray, 1988:71, wrote, "Even if the only business that could seem to benefit from such attitudes would be the business school business. In correcting the earlier problems, these two 1959 reports created other ones. Chapter 12: The Domination of the Business Functions. The business school most often ranked top in the popular magazine polls at the time this was first written in its MBA brochure for 2000-2002. Wharton has top-ranked departments in more areas than any other business school, including finance, entrepreneurship, insurance and risk management, marketing, real estate, and business law. Everything but management. Up went the walls. Carnegie may have focused on the social science disciplines, seeking to integrate them around concerns of administration, but something happened on its way to other business schools. Indeed, something happened on Carnegie's own way to the future. After a few years, the seams of this hoped-for integration began to split, soon to metamorphose into walls. By the early 1960s, GSIA's various intellectual groups had boiled down to two main camps: the economists and a loose combination of organizational theorists and management scientists, with a profound rift between them. Gleason and Schlossman, 1995:29. Bach resigned the deanship in 1962 and not long after left for the Stanford Business School. After Simon withdrew to the psychology department and Modigliani left the university, the rift grew wider. More significant, perhaps, as the walls went up in other schools, much as at GSIA, the social science disciplines came down. In some places, such as Wharton, SAS 1982:289, they departed to other parts of the university. In others, they were absorbed into the business functions, even if they sometimes dominated them, most notably the economists of finance. Soon these functions came to dominate the business schools, around which all its activities were organized. And as these functions became increasingly powerful, they also became increasingly disconnected from each other. Today, as such, they are rock solid in the business schools. Each pushes its own angle, its own content, its own biases, and, at the limit, its own ideology: shareholder value in finance, worker empowerment in organizational behavior, customer service in marketing, and so forth. Students are consequently left with what Whitehead, 1983, once called the passive reception of disconnected ideas. 2:11. The business school is a coalition of functional interests. Almost everything done in almost every business school today takes place in terms of the specialized functions, whether an idea researched, a program designed, a course taught, or a professor hired. This has less to do with any proven best way to manage or even to conduct business than with the structure of the business school itself. Each functional department gets a piece of the action. This is not to say that business schools do not teach material that cuts across the specialized functions, only that they do so within particular functions. So collaborative teamworking, for example, gets taught within organizational behavior, without collaboration or teamworking, and new product development gets taught in marketing or else in strategy, with the result that the schools rarely engage in new product development of their own. We know about the dangers of doing such things in business practice. Indeed, we teach about these dangers while we succumb to them in our own practice. As businesses work valiantly to bust down the walls between their silos, business schools work valiantly to reinforce them. Business schools teach a great deal about managing change, notably that it has to get past the existing categories. Yet because business schools themselves cannot, they remain more or less where the two foundation reports of 1959 put them. One concept of the business school inherited from GSIA. The genius of the original GSIA was its work across the disciplines and functions. 1. The disciplines were the roots, and research as well as the very notion of business and organization, also administration, or management, comprised the trunk, feeding out to the business functions, as branches. Now each of these branches has taken root on its own and stands apart from the others. Business managers certainly have to understand the business functions. At the very least, the functions constitute a need-to-know language of business. Moreover, especially for students with work experience in a single function, sales or production, classroom exposure to all the functions can broaden their understanding of the practice of business. But the practice of business is not the same as the practice of management. Management is not marketing plus finance plus accounting and so forth. It is about these things, but it is not these things. Pour each of these functions, of a different color, into that empty vessel called an MBA student, stir lightly, and you end up with a set of specialized stripes, not a blended manager. In 1984, Leonard Sales wrote an important yet forgotten article entitled Whatever Happened to Management? Or Why the Dull Stepchild? It expressed surprise that management was not taught in the management schools. Harvard still had its required course called Business Policy, introduced in 1912, but Stanford dropped the one it had offered in the 1930s, and a number of the other prestigious schools, such as MIT, had none. That problem was eventually solved, too, much like the others. Courses come to be offered about management, initially often called business policy, after the Harvard course. But they hardly taught management. They were touted as capstone, or integrative, courses, but they hardly accomplished such integration and, in that respect at least, were soon gone. How management became strategy. These courses about management were not so much eliminated as converted to something more compatible with the rest of the MBA curriculum. And ironically, or perhaps not, the replacement, right up the alley of the theory-oriented business schools, came from Harvard. Michael Porter received an MBA from the Harvard Business School and then crossed the river to do his doctorate in the economics department before returning as a professor in 1973. In 1980, he published Competitive Strategy, offering a solid if narrow analytical framework, and it took the policy courses by storm. The book quickly displaced the popular business policy text by Porter's colleague, originally learned it all, 1965, but including Porter in the 1982 edition by Christensen et al., made up primarily of cases, with some basic text dating mostly back to 1965. Strategy combines missions and markets, products and process into some coherent theory of the business, to use Drucker's 1994 phrase. Surely, then, it must be about synthesis. But not in Porter's view. I favor a set of analytic techniques to develop strategy, he wrote in The Economist in 1987. Analytic techniques to analyze strategy, perhaps, or to feed information into the strategy process. But analytic techniques to develop strategy? Chief among these were what Porter called industry analysis and competitive analysis. The book also contained a great deal of text that was remarkably reductionist in nature, checklist upon checklist. Moreover, for Porter in that book, strategies were not ideas to be invented so much as categories to be selected. He wrote at length about generic strategies. What all of this did, of course, was take strategy exactly where earlier efforts had taken marketing, finance, and other functions to a place compatible with what business schools had generally become. Porter taught the business schools to develop analysts, not strategists. For obvious reasons, the business schools embraced Porter's view. Even Harvard embraced it, although not without considerable conflict, which forced Porter and his followers to break away from what had come to be called the General Management Group and to form a new one, called Competition and Strategy. MBA students loved it, too. Here, finally, was some real analysis under the guise of management, something they could sink their analytical teeth into, and that would give them an advantage over experience, especially as consultants. At Harvard, Porter's book became the basis for a first-year required course and an extremely popular second-year elective. By 2000, after 88 years in the Harvard MBA curriculum, the required business policy course was gone, and a second required course in finance was added. Professors of management the world over embraced Porter's approach, too. It allowed them to gain the respect of their functional colleagues by dropping soft management in favor of hard analysis. It also provided them with a new basis to do respectable research. Instead of writing stories about strategy cases in one way or another, strategy professors could analyze the hard data of industries to hypothesize about which generic strategies worked best where. So as policy metamorphosed into strategy, and strategy later into strategic management, the field mushroomed as never before, with new courses and new journals, the latter ever more academic. Indeed, the new problem for the field was success. Colleagues in other functions adopted the word strategy, as well as many of Porter's uses of it, every which way in marketing strategy, financial strategy, IT strategy, and so forth, to the point where the strategy people began to feel besieged on all sides. Management as yet another function. It is important to appreciate exactly what this meant. With this shift from policy to strategy, and from concern for synthesis to focus on analysis, the one field in the business school that was supposed to be about general management itself became narrowly specialized. The very label strategic management implies that the management of strategy is something apart from management itself, another form of reductionism that has proven terribly destructive in practice, as I shall argue later. In other words, management found its place in the contemporary school of business by becoming yet another specialized function, in other words, by disappearing once again. As a consequence, these days if you are interested in teaching and researching about management, you may have difficulty finding a job in a business school. The old functions want you, and the new function of strategic management may shun you as well. Of course, there is always organizational behavior. But this area has not always shown great interest in management either. For example, research on the practice of managing itself remains rare, let alone on the behavior of organizations. For organizational behavior is mostly about the behavior of people in organizations. Indeed, it has often become functional in recent years, too. As human resources have replaced people in its lexicon, human resource management has replaced organizational behavior. Costella 2000:146. To conclude, the typical business school today is about specialization, not integration, concerned with the business functions, not the practice of managing. Courses exist about management, but they are not particularly mainstream. There have been continuous efforts to have more of them, but as shall be discussed later, they have not met with great success. Does this mean that managerial skills are absent from the MBA curriculum? Not quite. And that brings us to the heart of the problem. Chapter 13, Management by Analysis. That old joke about the MBA standing for Management by Analysis is no joke at all. Analysis means the process of separating something into its constituent elements, New Oxford Dictionary of English. Indeed, the word analysis itself comes from a Greek root meaning to unloosen. Separating things into parts, unloosening them from the whole, is what MBA programs are about. Business becomes a collection of functions, strategy, a set of generic strategies and competitive analyses. Even people become analytical things. Here is what a popular organizational behavior textbook out of Harvard had to say about people. We view human resources as social capital. The implication is that the development of workforce capabilities, attitudes, and international relations must be thought of within an investment paradigm. As with other investment decisions, a long-term perspective, sometimes well beyond the current accounting period, is required. Beer et al., 1985:12-13, NO Synthesis in Analysis. The danger of breaking things apart, as Humpty Dumpty discovered to his chagrin, is that it may not be possible to put them back together. Business schools have not been able to put things back together again because that has to happen in context in specific situations. Synthesis is the very essence of management. Within their own contexts, managers have to put things together in the form of coherent visions, unified organizations, integrated systems, and so forth. That is what makes management so difficult and so interesting. It's not that managers don't need analysis, rather, it's that they need it as an input to synthesis, and that is the hard part. Teaching analysis devoid of synthesis thus reduces management to a skeleton of itself. This is equivalent to considering the human body as a collection of bones. Nothing holds it together, no sinew or muscle, no flesh or blood, no spirit or soul. Accordingly, Mastering Management, a book produced as a kind of composite MBA in conjunction with Wharton, the London Business School, and IMD, opens with the following statement. Mastering management is about general management, but that subject itself is not covered as such, since general management is the synthesis of many management functions, such as accounting and marketing, which are covered in their own right in other modules of Mastering Management. Financial Times 1997:3. Even if we were to accept this silly claim, the question remains of where the synthesis comes from. The usual, dismissive, answer is the students. They will put it together. Think of this as the IKEA model of management education. The schools supply the pieces, neatly cut to size. The students do the assembly. Unfortunately, the schools don't supply instructions. Worse still, the pieces don't fit together. They may look neat, but in fact they are cut every which way. And the students don't know what to build, because that depends on the situation, and in the classroom there is no situation, or else several a day in cases. Real management is closer to playing with Lego blocks. There is an infinite number of ways to assemble the pieces, and the interesting structures take time to build. And so we have this comment from a business school dean, that the prominent consulting firm in which he used to work officially gave up on the notion that graduates of the Harvard Business School or Stanford knew anything more about thinking integratively about business problems than a Swarthmore or Amherst or Williams. Undergraduate in philosophy, Roger Martin of the University of Toronto, interviewed in the Financial Times, September 11, 2000. He added in another interview, they were clever and knowledgeable, but had no overarching framework to apply to problems that ran across the academic disciplines they had studied, in Schachter 1999:51. There is one MBA program that may have a valid claim to synthesis, and it highlights the problem. At Rochester, everything is built around economics. Using the discipline of economics as the basis for studying management permits us to offer the most integrated MBA curriculum of any leading business school. That might well be true. The trouble is that management is not economics. Even if the dean does claim in his letter that the school prepares you not just for a job, but for a lifetime career in management. 38. Reducing managing TO decision-making TOANALYSS. Is perhaps more reasonable to argue that the practice of managing is not so much excluded from MBA programs as reduced to one particularly narrow dimension of itself, decision-making as analysis. To quote a prominent Stanford professor, I would estimate that about 80% of the MBA curriculum in top-rated American business schools is concerned with just the issue of analytic problem-solving. Levitt 1989:37. One might have expected Carnegie and its followers to reduce managing to decision-making. But Harvard did exactly the same thing. For example, that business policy textbook referred to earlier, Christensen et al. 1982, repeatedly used the words choice and decision to describe the strategy process, as if creating a strategy is equivalent to making a decision, which it, of course, is in a case study classroom. Even the Harvard Business Review used to describe itself on its cover as the magazine of decision makers. As noted earlier, while managers certainly have to make decisions, far more important, especially in large networked organizations of knowledge workers, is what they do to enhance the decision-making capabilities of others. Reducing managing to decision-making is bad enough. Reducing decision-making to analysis can be far worse. Formally at least, there are various stages in the decision-making process: identifying the issue in the first place, diagnosing its character, finding and inventing possible choices, evaluating them to select one, and seeing that one through to action. Most of these stages are soft, see Mintzberg et al. 1976, and so not amenable to systematic analysis. The one exception is the evaluation of possible choices, so this is where decision-making treated as analysis is focused. It is a narrow view indeed. In his article on the myth of the well-educated manager, Livingston wrote, "Formal management education programs typically emphasize the development of problem-solving and decision-making skills, but give little attention to the development of skills required to find the problems that need to be solved, to plan for the attainment of desired results, or to carry out operating plans once they are made." In Livingston's opinion, this distorts managerial growth by overdevelop an individual's analytic ability while leaving his or her ability to take action and get things done underdeveloped. 89. Reducing analysis TO technique. There is a fine line between teaching analysis and promoting technique. That line is crossed when the illustration becomes the application, so that thinking gets reduced to the use of a formula. A technique might be defined as something that can be used in place of a brain. There is a great deal of mindless application of techniques these days, especially in North American management practice, and the blame has to be laid on MBA education alongside aggressive consulting, insecure managers, and a superficial business press hungry for easy answers. MBA programs tend to attract pragmatic people in a hurry. They want the means to leap past others with experience. Techniques, so-called tools, seem to offer that, so this is what many such students demand, and what many of the courses offer, whether portfolio models for financial resources, competitive analyses for strategic resources, or empowerment techniques for human resources. Offer enough of this, and you end up with schools of business technology. The trouble, here once again, is that technique has to be tied to context. It must be modified for use in a specific situation. Frederick Taylor had it right back in 1908 when he refused a request by the dean of the new Harvard Business School to teach his famous scientific management. He claimed it could only be learned on the shop floor. Spender 1997:23. Technique applied with nuance by people immersed in a situation can be very powerful. But technique taught generically, out of context, encourages that rule of the tool: give a little boy a hammer and everything looks like a nail. MBA programs have given their graduates so many hammers that many organizations now look like smashed-up beds of nails. Think of this as a problem of push. MBA programs push theories, concepts, models, tools, techniques in a disconnected classroom. Management practice, however, is about pull what is needed in a particular situation. Managers can certainly use a toolbox full of useful techniques, but only if they appreciate when to use each. As the chief executive of a pharmaceutical company told a group of MBA students, "My problem is that when I face a problem, I don't know what class I'm in." This whole problem of analysis is highlighted by the business school's requirements for mathematics. In their 1959 report, Gordon and Howell complained about the many business school students who lack. That is the heart of managers, not MBAs. If it helped, a quick subscribe keeps more summaries coming. So how do business and management connect? That is exactly where we started. Go back to the top and watch it click into place.